and welcome to Bad Marriages in the Bible.
Welcome back, everyone.
I'm Kate.
I'm Sean.
And you have found Dandelion Ministries, where we share the grace of Jesus Christ in your place of need.
Mm-hmm.
And we are also partners in crime and ministry, and we also love to create art. Sean's a musician. I like visual art. So those creative spaces mean a lot to us about the deep desires that come out when you get creative, whatever your form of creativity is. Maybe it's working in the garden or designing a really cool interior space or cooking or whatever that is that you feel that surge of joy. Working with your hands. It always involves working with your hands, it seems, in some way. But that's where kind of those deep desires, the things that you'll spend time doing, come out. And also it's where you really connect to truth outside of you too, where truth can hit you in different places. And so encountering a piece of visual art, it will strike you, it will act upon you, or a profound or some kind of song, you're going to have a reaction to it, whether it's good or bad, like a happy reaction, a positive one, or an angry one, or like a really, I don't like that. That is when art is at its best. It is speaking to a deep place in you too.
Yeah. Architecture can do the same thing. These types of things. I'm just remembering some of the houses we saw when we were in Toronto last, couple weeks back.
Deeply disturbed you.
And I was like, I hate that house. And but that happens. And it's just somebody's expression out there and they're getting a response from you. But it does connect. I mean, that's, as you're saying, what is it? What is it about that place that makes me hate it so deeply? It's something about me, right? It's revealing something in me. And that's what art does. Good art is it brings a response. So, and the wonderful thing we love about it is that, like you said, it just connects to those places of need. There's something in us that needs to be loved and healed and forgiven. All of us. And art is a wonderful way of getting around our defenses, because we're all spending most of our time, whether consciously or not, trying to defend ourselves from having to need grace. We're trying to convince ourselves and the world around us that we know what we're doing and we're okay. Even though the truth is we're desperate for somebody to, like the Adam Sandler's, what is it? The Wedding Singer. My gosh, I was blanking. His buddy says, I just want somebody to hold me and tell me everything's going to be okay. And that is the truth about every human being on earth. And that is what the gospel does by God's grace, thankfully. And that's what we want to show. We create space for you to hear that word where you really need it, even if you're not admitting it.
Yes.
And one of the best places where you will feel it and you almost can't help but admit it is in your primary relationships.
like marriage, Sean.
Like marriage, where you find yourself, as we were told when we were dating, one of the marriage exposes your selfishness in a way that very few relationships do. And so you get confronted with yourself a lot because you're engaging with someone else all the time.
We can speak from experience. That was the other part of my intro, is that, we like those creative spaces for those reasons we just discussed. And then also we are married. And so we're talking about bad marriages in the Bible because there are so many, because the writers, inspired by the Holy Spirit, told you all of their nitty gritty stories.
Yeah, they tell the dirt. They bring the skeletons out of the closet in the Bible.
Yes, because that is what the power of God's love and forgiveness and grace in your greatest place of need does. You end up boasting about your weaknesses and telling others about your mistakes and your wrong turns, because you have a faithful God who loves you more than those things, deeper than anything that you could deserve. He has loved you when you don't deserve it. And that has given you real life and real hope and the desire to connect to somebody else and to boast in your weakness, because you have a powerful God on your side. Yes. And that is what we long for all of the people in relationships, which is everybody who's listening to this, you all have relationships in your life. You have a mother, you have a dad, you have coworkers, friends, and you may have children, and you probably have a spouse if you're listening to this, but you may not, and that's fine too. Welcome. We're so glad because we all have these deep relationships, and God cares about you and your relationships, and he has big redemption in store.
That's right. I'll tell you about a relationship that I had recently where I was, we bought this house 4 years ago now, and it came with a dead lawnmower in the garage. And I was able to resurrect the thing. I like working with engines and things like that. So I was able to get the thing working again, and it served us well for 4 years. And then this summer, just a week or 2 weeks ago.
I mean, honestly, it was like the 9 lives. You've resurrected it so many times.
Yeah, it always had a major issue every year, but I was bringing it back every year. And then this year, it finally died. It really died. It seized up and it's dead. And so I called, I was like, but I looked on YouTube, which is, as one does, and there's people out there saying, oh, if it's a seized engine, you can still make it work, blah, blah, blah. I tried everything. I got it to at least crank again. Nothing. Still, so I call the lawnmower repair guy down the street.
Literally, that's the job that's on their
That's what
sign.
their job is.
Yeah.
I call the guy. I have a lawnmower. It's broken. He repairs them. So this is what I call him. So this is the relationship that I'm telling you about. And it was primary for me that day. And because I needed my lawnmower to be fixed. I call him and I explain the situation to him. And he says, I don't want anything to do with it.
Because of the age.
Because, he's like, it's probably 20 years old or more. And I'm like, yeah, it's probably like 40 years old. But either way, he's like,
Might be older than us.
I don't want everything to do with it. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I was like, you're not even going to look at it? And he's like, no. And I was like, I'm internally, I'm like, what the heck? You're a lawnmower repairman. I have a broken lawnmower that needs to be repaired. Why are you not fixing it? So I ended up, in a moment of frustration, I did say to him, I was like, what good is your service then if you're not even going to look at it? And then he hung up on me. And that I was not okay. I was like so ticked at this guy for one, being a lawnmower repairman who doesn't want to repair a lawnmower. So I was really frustrated. And my sin came out in that moment. He was obviously being less than helpful. And I don't think he's good at customer service, which is one of his goals in his job. But I let him know my disappointment. Then he hung up on me, and I was so incensed that he hung up on me after my kind of snarky comment. And it was funny. We laughed about it with our daughter and blah, 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 that she was listening to the whole thing. So it's one of those great parenting moments where I was excelling. And but that, I tell that stupid, ridiculous story because that is such an insignificant relationship. It lasted for all of 6 minutes on the phone. But it still threw me for a loop. It brought out my sin for sure. And he was obviously sinning too. I want everybody to know that. But still, it was a moment where I was like, okay, this is humbling. And that was the fun part about it with our daughter is that, your kids are like these mirrors to you. When you do whatever you do with other people in the world, and they watch you do it, it's like, oh crap, I'm not handling this well. I don't want them to behave like this when they're adults. Anyway, that's all to say that you need grace. I needed grace. I needed forgiveness. That man needs forgiveness. He needs also to start a different business or not be in business at all. And but that's just a small example to talk about how it's in relationship that we are confronted with ourselves often. And even on the most insignificant things, obviously in marriage, we're dealing with much bigger issues than dead lawnmowers. But
well, in this case, I think our daughter's presence also helped. My presence there probably helped too, but you encountered the law. You encountered conviction about the way you'd handled it and certainly clear conviction on how he handled it too.
That's right. I was very clear that he handled it incorrectly.
It's so clear. And so that we see God's 2 words to us in the Bible. He'll speak one to convict, and in order to drive us to his mercy and rescue and his grace and forgiveness. And he has done that through his son Jesus, by sending Jesus to die for our sins and forgive us and rise from the dead and be stronger than those things and lead us in a much better way. Which, I mean, the fact that you could laugh about it and talk about it with our daughter was a huge, I think, real learning, wonderful thing for her, for you.
Yeah, I was glad to serve her in that way.
And so that's what we see in the passage that we're going to address today, which is found in Ezra chapters 9 and 10. We've been marching through the Bible, literally chronologically, and we had
chronologically according to the books of the Bible, meaning like their order.
Yeah, just like if you were to read it yourself and turn the pages.
I make the distinction because of what Kate's going to get to, I think.
Yes.
Here.
So when you stumble upon the book of Chronicles, the book of Kings and Chronicles.
First Kings, Second Kings. There's 2 of each.
First Chronicles, Second Chronicles. They work in tandem with each other. And so you kind of, and they are telling the historical narrative of Israel.
The kingdom of Israel.
Yeah, the kingdom of Israel, and of how God sent his prophets to them to speak his promises, to bring them back to his covenant, his promise to them, and to bring them back to him all the time. So they were giving those 2 words of conviction: you have wandered away, come back. And also promise: I am coming to do what you cannot do yourselves. I'm coming to be that king, that shepherd, that husband, that father, that rescuer, the redeemer, and the Messiah. So those were what the prophets, he sent his prophets to his people all the time. It also tells a story of when they were sick of the prophets and wanted their own kings and what happened under the kings. And eventually the northern tribes split away from the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and they were ultimately captured by the Assyrians, conquered, and they assimilated into other nations.
And they were taken, a lot of them were taken away into exile.
Never to return again.
Yeah, just to be slaves. I mean, it's like what you did. If you were a conquering nation, you're like, oh, we conquered these people. We need to build a new temple to whoever or whatever, and we're going to make them all do that work.
That's right. And so the books of First and Second Kings follow more the northern tribes. You see the rise of, the prophets Samuel and David and Saul,
yes,
David,
Saul
and Solomon. Sorry, and then the split of the kingdoms, and then the kings really deal with the northern tribe and what happened with them, and the prophets that you might have heard of, Elijah and Elisha, sent to the northern tribes. And Chronicles tells a story mostly of the southern tribe, Judah and Benjamin. And so that's what we've been reading through. And ultimately, there were kings that worshiped God and wanted to lead the nation in worshiping the Lord.
Yeah, there's a few good ones sprinkled throughout.
But there were also so many who didn't. And ultimately, God lets them also be overtaken by the Babylonians, and they get exiled too. And he had been warning them all along, and in the sort of natural, from their point of view, he was warning them against making alliances with other nations, and they were making kind of bad business deals, bad trusting themselves to other nations and weakening themselves. Basically, that's what was happening on the ground. But their hearts also were not at all towards following God, and so God
became. They're just people like us. They became driven by the same things we were, which was wealth and success and power and influence, And so in the kings themselves, which was one of the warnings that Samuel gives, we talked about this months back, but he gave the warning that the kings are going to tax you. They're going to take your kids into war, and they're going to drain you ultimately, even though you want to be like everybody around you. That was why Paul, if you're reading the New Testament, when Paul the apostle wants to make a big point about sin in our lives in Romans 7, he picks covetousness. He doesn't pick murder or adultery or anything like those things. He picks coveting because it's something that nobody, like all of us don't think it's that big of a deal, but it's something that we're all doing all the time. And that was what the Israelites were doing. They were coveting their neighbors, saying, well, they've got kings and kingdoms and we want to be like them. And they reject God and they take kings. And as Kate said, it ends in exile. And God tells them from the start, this is where this is going to go. Mm. And that's all law. It's all law. Mm-hmm. Him telling you doesn't prevent you from doing it. Yeah. Frankly. Mm-hmm. And they do end up in exile.
So he does give them, a taste of boundaries, of tough love. This is what you have done to yourselves. You have weakened yourselves towards all of these other nations, and I'm going to let you be overtaken by them. I have defended you in the past. I'm not going to. This is a consequence of your own actions. And that's one of those, tough boundary things where you see it's a mirror to yourself of like what I've just done to myself. Yeah. and this was a taste of a consequence for their actions. It wasn't even the full consequence.
No, and he's still when we read, as Kate's talking about this, as we get into the prophets, which are all looking, the Bible's ordered this way where it has the narrative and it goes up through Chronicles, and then we get to Ezra and Nehemiah where we are, which is the end chronologically in terms of time passing of the Old Testament. But then we have all these prophets after that before we get to the New Testament. And all those prophets are the ones that spoke to the kingdoms and to the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. And we hear in them, they're telling them all the time, you're going to be taken out. This is not going to go well, all this stuff. And yet at the end of almost every single one, there's a promise that I'm going to return. I'm going to save a remnant. I'm going to bring you back.
And I'm going to do it for my own sake, not because you deserve it, but for my own sake, because I'm love. God is a lover, and that means he's jealous of us, and he wants us just the way a husband and a wife want each other. That, and I don't want you to be with anybody else.
Right.
And I would fight for you. If that were to happen, and that kind of love. So or a mother or a father fighting for a child that's gotten into trouble. Yeah. And so that being carried away into exile was part of a consequence.
It was a punishment.
It was a punishment. And it was part of the consequence of under the law. Mm-hmm. And an even greater point was that it was exposing to the Israelites. It was the prophets were saying, you're chosen. Like you were nobody, you were nothing, and God chose you and gave himself fully to you and rescued you from slavery and brought you into a beautiful land and made you like an abundant kingdom and gave you all of these things just because that's who he is. And he wanted to be with you and wanted to enjoy you. And you've forsaken all of that. And you've said, I can do a better job myself. I don't want your help. I don't want to have anything to do with you. I want to go worship, these other gods and live in terror under them. And so it's that human condition we've seen since page 1 of the Bible or page 3 of the Bible.
Chapter 3.
And it's that human condition where we just naturally will go to our selfish reasons and what we think we can do a better job, and we invent gods and then worship them. And so God was showing us that we have unholy hearts, that we don't have hearts that can follow him, that we are broken lovers, as we say all the time in this podcast. And so that's the bigger narrative. The stronger one is showing the guilt even within God's chosen people, the ones that he had rescued from slavery, the ones who know him, who have the prophets and have the promises and have all the history, even them, they just couldn't stay with it. We just can't stay with the training program or the diet. We just can't do it. And so that is, there's kind of the natural consequences of dealing with your own actions. And then also the sin, the broken love that was in their hearts that the law could not fix. So, which was getting us ready for his promised Savior, his own son, Jesus, who would take the full consequence for all of those, all the sin that we could throw at God and throw at each other.
Right. What the exile was foreshadowing.
Yeah.
The full weight of the curse that was given to Adam and Eve as a result of their sin.
Yeah.
Actual separation and death. Right.
Because during the exile, God was actually gracious. He provided for all the exiles, and there's all these amazing stories in Daniel and Esther and Ezekiel of how God provided and was gracious to them over in exile, and then brings a remnant back. And he was even gracious and faithful to the Samaritans, the northern tribes who kind of were syncretistic. And so there are all these stories of how he was gracious and staying with, even in the midst of the punishment for their sins and the consequences for their actions, to use today's terms. But Jesus was going to take the full brunt of what it takes to forgive us of sin and to give us a new heart that cannot be corrupted, a holy heart fully after God, which is his heart that he puts in us through his Holy Spirit. And we receive it by faith, by hearing this promise that God has forgiven you in Jesus, and that he has adopted you and brought you into his family. And you can never lose that. He's with you in your failures, with your training program, or with the lawnmower fix-it repairman, or with your spouse with whom you are butting heads. So that's where we're going to enter into the story right now. Is the exiles have returned from Persia. They were taken into captivity by the Babylonians, and then Babylon got overtaken by Persia, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, in some crazy miracle that God had done.
Holy Spirit.
Yep. He was like, you know what? I'm going to release all those Jewish captives so they can go back and worship their God and rebuild their city and their temple. I'm going to let them all go back. And I'm going to send them with money to do it. And all the stuff that I took from them, or that the Babylonians took, I'm going to return all that stuff. So they get to take all that money, and we're going to protect them, and we're going to send them back. So they had been sent back in this total miracle and this remnant had returned to rebuild and the temple and rebuild the city and their homes. And a little ways in, there was a Jewish scribe in Babylon who his heart was very moved towards the remnant that had returned, and he really wanted to make sure that they were staying faithful to God and, reading the scriptures, reading the Old Testament, and following all the 10 Commandments and following all the steps that they're supposed to do to worship him. And his name was Ezra. And he was like, I want to go back. And so the king Artaxerxes was like, you can. Take a group of people with you, go on back. And so Ezra goes back, and they celebrate the Passover, and they worship God, and they thank him for, bringing them back. And then he looks around, and he sees that this remnant that has returned a little bit before him have already turned away from God's commandments and from worshiping God. And that especially, it says in Ezra chapter 9, verse 2, that they had, forgotten to worship the Lord, and they had married foreign wives, and they had gone after their gods. And in this faithlessness, the hand of the officials and the chief men had been foremost. So it was like the leaders had done that the most.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I just wanted to add the reason why we're jumping ahead and over Chronicles is because there is no marriage in Chronicles. Like, aren't any married? I mean, no marriage is highlighted anyway. What we're getting into here is the overarching marriage of God and his people Israel and their faithlessness to him. And so that's why Kate gave that really excellent summary for you, so you know where we are in the Bible.
You're
No,
like
it's
not
fine.
bored to death.
No, it was good. And why we're not jumping into Chronicles for you right now. But Ezra and Nehemiah get into this issue of intermarriage, and it's a big problem for them, according to God's law. And so we're going to hear, as Kate's telling us, how Ezra responds to that, and how, as she said, it takes no time at all. They start intermarrying with the people that were still in Israel, because I think we've described that before to you, but just so you know, the Samaritans were the folks who intermarried with, they were kind of the ones who were left after the exile, and they intermarried with the surrounding peoples that moved into Canaan or were still left in Canaan, because in the original, what's the word I'm looking for here? Command from God. They were supposed to clean out the land under Joshua after Moses and everything like that. And they never fully did that. And so there were still people hanging out there. Even though the Jews were all taken away into exile, there were still people living in the land of Canaan. And a bunch of Jews still stayed there, and they intermarried, and they became half-breeds, which is what the Samaritans were. And they were considered the lowest of the low, which is what happens in the New Testament when Jesus interacts with Samaritans. The disciples and others are like, "What is he doing?" And so the remnant comes back, and they start intermarrying as well, because they're like, "Wow, look at all these hot daughters," or whatever. Because it's always that. It's just the intermarriage thing is always levied at the men. It's always addressed to the men, and it says even in the original law back in Deuteronomy and in Exodus is where God says, don't take any of these foreign tribes, their daughters, for your sons, or give your sons to their daughters or anything like that. Don't do it, because they're going to lead you into idolatry.
And that really is, it's not a racist thing. It's not, because I hate other ethnicities.
Right. No.
Or skin colors or anything like that. It's about the faith. That's what God cares about.
They're worshiping other gods, and and that's the warning is given not because like you're so holy you need to protect your holiness. That's what we often think. This is the way we often, especially in the Christian world, like the church is, when you hang out with certain Christian groups, especially the Baptists love to do this kind of stuff, and it's true. I'm not saying, like, I'm sure they'd be like, that's right. And this idea of like, no card playing, no drinking, no rock and roll music, like these types of things that stereotypes that you may have heard. Some of it's real. I mean, I encountered some of that in my life. And I remember, I think I've said this before on this podcast, I threw out all my Led Zeppelin at one point in college, which was like such a mistake. And I had all this music and I was like, I think the Lord, was in this kind of weird holiness kick thing. And I threw out all my music. And for some reason, that's always the thing that young Christians do. They're going to be tarnished or somehow wounded and, made toxic by this rock and roll music. And I have since purchased it all back. But this idea of like, we need to preserve our holiness. When you actually read the commands that God's giving, he's saying it because he's like, you are incredibly weak. Like when you guys, specifically you men, see a hot girl, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, she's a hot girl. I can't do anything about it. I have to take her. I have to have her, or I have to give her to my son or something. Like, and that's just important for you women to remember the power that you have over us. We are completely weak in front of this. And that's what God knows. He knows that you're going to, just like Solomon, we covered before, you're going to take these women and you are going to give them whatever they want because you are weak and you are not going to be able to stand up for your principles. You're going to worship whatever they want because you're going to be like, whatever you want, babe. You're so hot. I love you.
It's like in the musical Hamilton, and he's like, how can I say no to this?
Yeah, exactly.
How can I say no to this? So Deuteronomy 7, you are a chosen people, a treasured possession. Moses is saying to them, like, God has picked you out, not because that you were anything special unto yourselves, but because he loved you. You're a treasured possession, chosen, meant to be holy to the Lord, meant to be his, meant to worship him the way he loves you and thank him and the way he provides for you. That's what you're meant to do, and to be set apart. And he's like,
which is what holiness is. One of the definitions of holiness is just to be set apart.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. His special people. Just the way a husband would feel about his bride.
Yeah.
And so, and if you marry these people with other faiths, you are going to be taken away into worshiping their gods. And you're going to wonder, oh, well, maybe I should add. Maybe I should add this or that, or, and then
what's the harm? I'll have a little temple to so-and-so over here. Right.
And the gods of today of just greed and career and power. And you've already said those things. Selfishness, guarding ourselves, just any of that is what God was wanting to prevent with just stay within people who worship God also. Marry those people, not other foreign wives. That's what the intention of it was.
Well, it was, yeah. I mean, in the immediate, that's the way it sounds. You're exactly right. And it's this idea, it's one of those things where I think I've said this before too, but when we use that language, of the wanting, it's when we get to the New Testament and we see Jesus teach the law, and then we see Paul look back on all of the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus, we see that Paul is like, the law was never actually given to prevent any of this. Like it
was meant to convict you.
It was never actually going to prevent it. And it's because the law doesn't give you any power. It just makes a demand of you. And so all the power is on your side. It requires things of you. And I'm telling you to do something, and I'm not going to give you any power. I'm just saying you've got to do this. And if you don't do it, you're going to die.
There's going to be all these bad consequences.
Yeah, and if you do, then everything will be great. And so then all the power sits with you. That's how the law functions.
That is.
And
you feel all of it on your shoulders.
Yeah. And so what the law then, when we actually look at this testimony of Scripture, and what Kate just spent the first part of the episode summarizing. No, it was not. It was good. But it was like the narrative of the Bible and the whole Old Testament is showing the powerlessness of his people.
Yeah.
And of us. And the whole point of him even saying, like, I've chosen you, not because of anything special, just because I love you and I've chosen you. It's all hanging on God there. That's a different thing because that's a promise. But the law is one that just shows our lack of power. It's demanding something of you and you can't do it. And that's right. That's where this is going.
That's where we're in the rub, and we're going to end soon and maybe finish it later. But I want to take you into Ezra chapter 9. So they realize, Ezra's like, oh my gosh, I've been here for 5 minutes and I see that all of the leaders and the priests who are like the leaders, they're supposed to be leading people. They've already married other wives. They're already turning away to follow other religions. And that was the whole point of why God exiled them and then brought them back, was to worship him and to be reconnected to him. And so they are found guilty under the law. And that's what it does. It convicts you. And it's all on your shoulders to try to repair this. And that's what they do. They see, oh my gosh, we have, and he lists their names just to make sure everybody knows who has been guilty of this. And, he fasts and then he's like, we need to examine the matter. We need to ask for God's mercy, and we need to promise to put the foreign wives away so that you would only worship God and not anybody else. And that's how Ezra ends. And the last sentence of it and all of these married, he lists all the people who had done it. And he said, all these have married foreign women, and some of the women had even borne children. And there you hear the grief.
That's the end of Ezra.
That's the end of Ezra. You hear the grief, and this was a horrible pain, like a source of grief and consequence.
Yeah, these people, like these kids didn't choose. This is not their fault. They now have to deal with the fact that they're going to be treated as, at best, second class, if not sent packing, like happened with Abraham and Hagar. And so that whole situation is being repeated here. So it's important to see that the bookends of Israel's chosen, like when God makes his covenant with Israel, he makes it with Abraham first. And what does Abraham do before he even has Isaac? He sleeps with Hagar and has Ishmael, right? And it's like a total this is us, our best thinking, as we've talked about before. And then we see the bookend at the end of, because what Ezra is leading us up to, Ezra and Nehemiah are taking us to the end of the Old Testament period,
the history.
And so like there's a 400-year gap between the end of the narrative in the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament when John the Baptist comes on the scene, and this is the end of it. And we're seeing that they've done the exact same thing that Abraham did at the very beginning. And so we're just like, I say that to you because this is for all of us who still, because we all wake up every day. All of us wake up every day thinking that we have to do something to earn our way, to prove ourselves, to kind of finally do it right. And that endeavor, the self-improvement endeavor, the self-justification endeavor never works. This is hundreds of years later after Abraham, and they've heard the law the entire time. I mean, since Moses to now, and they've never been able to do it. And they are still as in need in this moment as Adam and Eve were the day they ate of the fruit, right? I mean, like this is the verdict of the Old Testament.
Yes.
And it's just crying out like, oh man, we need mercy. Like you said, Ezra, there was like, we need God's mercy because we continue to do the same thing.
That's right. We love this band, Waterdeep, and Lori and Don Chaffer. And Lori has a line in one of her songs, and she's summarizing the entire Old Testament. And she says, what made it through the flood is covered in rust. And then she says, we need a second chance. And that's like a poetic way of like, oh my gosh, you need more than a second chance.
Yeah, we need a million. We need a new life.
We need
a completely new thing.
That's right. And the prophets are full of this. So Ezra is bringing you, oh my gosh, we're all guilty. We cannot, if this is the way we're supposed to relate to God, this is like, we can't do it.
Yeah, we're in trouble.
We're in trouble. It's showing us we are just idolaters. We just want to turn somewhere else. And there's collateral damage every time we do. And even when you make following the law your whole business, there's collateral damage there too. God is actually after something more and better than you following the law. He is after you knowing his forgiveness and his grace and his heart in you. And it's going to produce a new desire and a desire for life and for freedom and for something that's really loving for you, for him, in gratitude, and for your your spouse too. It's going to be truly loving, but it's a totally new thing that he does, born out of his forgiveness, not out of your obedience. So
praise God.
Yes. So we're going to pick up on what happens with the rest of this bad marriage next time.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes. Sean's email, if you have any questions, is right there, Sean@dandelionministries.org. We would welcome you to share this on your favorite podcasting platform with your family and friends, and
give us a review.
That'd be great.
And there's also a link if you want to support us. We do everything through charitable giving. That's the way we support ourselves in ministry. And so there's a link for you to support Dandelion if you want in the show notes.
Thank you for listening. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.